Hi everyone, welcome back to Grounded Haven. Today I'm going to be making some fresh pasta, and I'm going to be showing you 3 different ways that I'm going to be putting them to use, cooking them, or preserving them for a later date. Now that it's springtime and we're getting lots of eggs from our chickens, making fresh pasta is a great way to use up some of those eggs, and it's something that I've really been getting into in the last year or two. Today I'm going to be making a double batch of pasta and then splitting it up and doing a few different things with them. So I feel like when most people think of fresh pasta, they think of, I guess, more like typically Italian dishes. You can use it in tomato sauce or maybe cream sauces or dry whole sheets for lasagna. So I am going to be using some of the pasta that way this week, but I also really like to use egg pasta in other types of dishes. I really like to use them in my Chinese cooking. So I'll boil the noodles and maybe stir fry them up with vegetables and add some sort of like soy sauce type of sauce to them and use them as stir fried egg noodles. I also like to put them in noodle bowls, and that's another way I'm going to be using them this week. And I am going to be making a double batch of pastas, and even though I already have a couple of meals set aside for the week where I have planned to use the fresh pasta, I think I'll still have some extra, so I'm also going to be dehydrating some of that today. Fresh pasta is really easy to preserve for later use. You can either dehydrate or freeze it, and I find that both ways work really well. I've done both of them and they're both great. I find that cooking the pasta from either of these methods, it still turns out really good. When you preserve your fresh homemade pasta, I find that it cooks up almost as if you had made it the same day. I usually can't tell a difference. You still get a lot of that nice springiness because you do have eggs in there, whereas usually if you buy pasta from the store, they don't have eggs, it's just flour and water. So having that egg in there makes it so that the texture stays really good, even if the pasta has been previously frozen or dehydrated. For the recipe that I've been using, each batch of pasta will use 3 eggs. So I'll be using 6 eggs today, but you can always scale this recipe up if you have a lot of eggs that you want to use up and preserve in the form of pasta. I know a lot of people like to do that and make lots of pasta at once and either dry or freeze it. I personally don't really like to do really large batches of things. I prefer to do kind of like small to medium sized batches and do it more frequently. It makes it a little bit more manageable for me because we don't have the largest kitchen, and having counter space to like lay out all those pasta sheets and also to dry them in our house is a little bit tricky. So what I like to do is every couple of weeks or so when we're getting a lot of eggs, I like to try and make fresh pasta. We'll use some of it for the upcoming week, and then whatever I don't use, I can dehydrate or freeze. So that's what works for me, but you can do as little or as much as needed, whatever works best and what feels manageable for you. So first off, I have to mix up my dough, and the way I like to do that is with my food processor. It makes it a lot easier so I don't have to be kneading the dough for like 10 minutes. Pasta dough can be a little bit tough to knead because it's a little bit thicker than, say, bread dough. So I like to use my food processor. It makes it really easy. And because I'm using my food processor, that's also why I usually don't like to do like really large batches of dough, because I don't want to burn out my motor, because even in the food processor, I am going to be kind of mixing it around there for a couple of minutes. And since the dough is so dense, it can be a lot of wear and tear on my food processor since this one is a little bit older, but doing a couple batches should be no problem for it. So in the past, when I've made pasta dough, I used to use a recipe where I had 2 eggs and then I would just add water as needed, but I've kind of tweaked that and I've changed it to have 3 eggs, and I find that that works really well. I usually don't have to add any extra liquid. The eggs have a good amount of moisture to completely hydrate, and it also means that I get to use up more eggs, which is nice. So that's what I'm going to be doing today. I'm going to mix that up now and show you what it looks like. The recipe for the pasta dough is really simple. It's just 2 cups of all-purpose flour, half a teaspoon of salt, and 3 eggs. And I'm just using regular all-purpose flour here, nothing special, and I find that it works out really well. And I'm just going to mix up a single batch of the dough at a time, just so that it's manageable for my food processor. And what I like to do is just give it a few pulses just to start breaking up those eggs, and then I'll just let the food processor run completely on for a couple of minutes. And by giving it just a few pulses, first the flour doesn't completely like balloon all out of there, and as it goes, the dough is going to start to clump up and form a ball, and it's going to roll around in the food processor. Once the dough starts to come together, it is a very dense dough and it's going to be kind of rattling around in there and making a lot of noise, so you want to make sure that you're holding on so that your food processor doesn't run away. And it can be a little noisy and rowdy. Aaron actually came out of his office while I was doing this because he heard so much noise going on, so you can see that he popped into the kitchen here just to see what was happening and making sure that everything was okay. So just make sure you are attending to this dough and not leaving the machine running without supervision. After a few minutes, I'm going to remove that first batch from the food processor, get all of the dough out there. I'm gonna just briefly cover it with a kitchen towel, and you can already see how springy that dough is. When I kind of like press it down, you can see it immediately bounces back, so you can see lots of gluten has been formed while it's been mixing around in there. I'm going to set that aside just for a minute while I work up the second batch, which is going to be exactly the same thing. Once the second batch of dough is finished mixing, I'm going to remove that and mix it with the first batch of dough and just make one giant pasta dough ball. This would be pretty difficult to do for anything larger than 2 batches, but a double batch is completely manageable, I think, to just combine them into one ball, and then I'll just have one ball to wrap up. I'm giving it just a couple of kneads to combine here, and I'm going to form it into a ball, and you can see that when I press a finger in, the dough bounces back immediately, which is really great to see, but not great to work with, so I'm just gonna wrap that up with some plastic wrap. So I've just whipped up my pasta dough here and I wrapped it up in plastic wrap, and now probably the most important part of this process is I just have to let this rest for minimum probably half an hour, but I am probably going to let this go for a few hours. I'm just going to leave it on the counter, and letting it sit there will help to relax the gluten so that it is easier to roll out, because it would be impossible to do that right now. It's still like 11:30 right now, and I'm going to be making some of this pasta for dinner. So this is going to sit probably for like 4 or 5 hours. So actually maybe I'll stick this in the fridge. But it only took me a few minutes to whip up a couple batches of pasta in the food processor. It makes it super easy. And then we're gonna do the rolling out later today. And I feel like this kind of schedule works really well for me. I used to feel that making pasta was like a huge ordeal, and I would tell myself it like took too much time or effort, but I feel like getting into the groove of it and figuring out like a schedule that works for you really helps make it very doable even for a weeknight. And also, like most things, the more you do it, the easier it is. So you don't have that like mental block of thinking that making pasta is a lot of work. So after doing this for a few times, it just gets easier and easier for me to kind of like work up the effort to make it, because I know it can be one of those things that is a little bit intimidating at first. And it's also a super easy recipe to memorize as well. So once you've made it a couple times, you'll never have to like pull out a recipe card. You can just whip up a batch of pasta really easily in the morning, set it aside for a few hours, and then roll it out when you're ready to deal with it. So I think it's a good cooking skill that's great to learn. There are a lot of uses for pasta. So yeah, I'm just going to let this little pasta dough baby rest in the fridge. We're going to come back to it later in the day, and then I'm going to show you how I roll it out. I am going to be using a pasta roller today. You could try rolling it out by hand, but I am going to be using my pasta roller since I have it. So we will come back in a few hours and see how our dough looks. It is much later in the day now, as evidenced by the fact that I look a little more disheveled than before. I'm coming right out of an ab workout, aka 30 minutes of death, so this is what you're gonna get right now. And now it is time to make some pasta for dinner. So let me show you what the dough looks like and also my setup. So I like to take this dough out of the fridge probably about an hour before I'm gonna work with it. I kind of forgot, so this has only been out for maybe like 30 minutes. But let me just give this a little poke so you can see. So before I showed you when I poked the dough, it sprung back immediately. But now when I poke it, it kind of just leaves an indent, which is great. That means it's going to be really easy to work with. Also, I just have to say, like, have you seen the color of this dough? It is practically orange because those eggs that the chickens have been laying are just so rich and golden. Spring eggs are truly the best. So I'm gonna wrap this back up until I'm ready to work with it. You can make your dough in advance and use it up to a day later. It might discolor a little bit. The eggs in the dough will make it turn a little bit of like a grayish tinge. It's totally safe to eat. It just might be like a little bit unappetizing. So just a heads up if you plan to make your dough ahead of time. And this is gonna be my setup for making pasta. So we have our kitchen island here, but unfortunately our pasta maker doesn't work with the surface this thick. So I actually make my pasta on this table to the side because it is much thinner and I can mount my pasta maker onto this table. This is the one I have. It is just like a tabletop pasta maker. Aaron got this for me as a present many years ago, and I'm happy that it's getting a lot more use lately. So I've just like cleaned off the table and I'm basically just going to be using this whole surface. I also lay down a towel under my pasta maker just to catch some of the flour and whatever, but I'm going to be using this whole space for working. And then I also like to have the island empty and clean, and I'm just going to be laying my pasta sheets here in between the rolling out and the cutting because I like to kind of let it dry in between. So yeah, that's the setup. Junie? 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 Can you not? Junie? And if you're trying to get into the habit of making pasta more often, like I am, my tip is to not put your pasta maker somewhere where it is really difficult to get to or you have to like dig it out of places. So don't put it in your garage or your basement or like in the very back of a cabinet where you have to take out like 10 different things to get to it. You and I both know that you are never going to make pasta if that's what you have to do to get to your pasta maker. So just do yourself a favor, put it somewhere where it's a little bit easier to access. Not somewhere where like you need it every day, but just somewhere that's like not quite such a chore to get to. I find that that really helps a lot in getting myself motivated to make pasta more often. So now I keep my pasta maker in a cabinet that's like higher up but easy for me to get to so that if I just decide to make pasta that day, it is not as much of a barrier for me to go through that. And I think that definitely helps a lot in getting myself to make pasta more often. So that is another little tip for you. For the pasta that I'm going to be drying, I'm going to be doing something a little bit differently. In the past, I've just laid it flat either on some towels or on my dehydrator sheets. Also, I just want to mention I have tried dehydrating pasta in my dehydrator and I would really not recommend that. I don't know why, but when I did that, it was impossible to cook. I kind of tried to make it into these little nests and I dehydrated it that way, and the center of those nests just would not cook or rehydrate no matter how long I cooked it for. I don't know if there's some kind of trick that you need for dehydrating in a dehydrator, but from now on, I'm just air drying my pasta. As long as it is completely dried, it should be fine and safe to last for months. So yeah, I'm just going to be air drying today. Even though I'm saying dehydrating, I just mean that I'm letting all of the moisture evaporate out of the noodles. So yeah, in the past, I've just like laid my pasta flat to dry, but it is kind of annoying because I do have to kind of like make sure every pasta strand is not touching or overlapping so they don't stick to each other as they dry. So what I'm going to be doing today instead is I'm going to use some coat hangers and I'm gonna sanitize these, and I'm basically just going to loop the noodles off of these hangers and then hang it somewhere for it to dry. That way, I think it will be a lot faster for me to just like drape the noodles over rather than trying to lay like each individual noodle flat, because that is the most time-consuming part of drying pasta for me. Another thing you can do is just dry the pasta in wide sheets. That's a really great quick way to dry your pasta, and then you can use it for lasagna, and I do really like doing that. But today I want to stock up on my noodles, so I'll do that, and next time I make pasta I'll probably make some nice lasagna sheets because I've just used up the last of mine for that too. I usually cut my batch of dough into 4 pieces so that I have smaller pieces that are easier to work with, but again, since this is a double batch, I'm going to be cutting it into 8 pieces. And I do like to work with a couple of pieces at a time. This is one of my tips to kind of speed up the process a little bit, and I'll show you how that helps. But I'm taking the first couple of pieces that I'm going to be working with and lightly flouring them. And for the first pass, it doesn't really matter what shape it is. I just kind of like to sort of flatten it just to get it ready to go through the pasta machine, and then I'll set it to the widest setting. And for my pasta machine, this just means putting it on 0, and I'll run it through exactly as it is. And once it comes out, I'm going to fold it into thirds, kind of like an envelope, turn it 90 degrees, and then put it through the pasta machine again. This is going to give it a better texture and also helps you get kind of like a more rectangular shape. You can do this a couple of times. I'll usually do this once or twice depending on how it's looking. And then if needed, I'll flour a little bit more and then run it through the widest setting one more time. And I'm going to do the same thing with the other piece that I'm working with. Just send it through the pasta machine at 0, fold it into thirds, rotate it 90 degrees, and then put it through the machine 2 more times. Then I'm going to crank up the machine to the next setting, which is going to be 1, and roll it through again, 1 sheet at a time. And I only run the pasta through the machine twice for that first setting. Every setting after that, I just run it through 1 time. So now I'm just going to continue the process with both of my sheets of pasta, and hopefully you can see here, but basically I am running through both sheets at one setting, then going to the next one and running both sheets again. And by doing 2 sheets at once, it kind of saves you a little bit of time, because switching through each of those settings in between the sheets of pasta takes a little bit of time, and by rolling multiple sheets of pasta through before you have to change the setting, it does help you save time. So I usually just do this with 2 sheets at a time. You can do 3 or 4 if you have enough space to kind of like set out your sheets in between, but just keep in mind as you work with them, they are going to get longer and a little bit more unwieldy. So unless you have like a lot of space to lay them aside and then remember which sheet you did through which setting, I find it's just easier to just stick with 2 sheets at a time. I'm going to make sure I flour the sheets as often as is needed. If I feel that they're starting to get a little bit tacky, they will start to stick to the rollers, and you might get rips in your pasta while you're rolling it out. And every pasta machine's settings are going to be a little bit different, but on my machine, I usually go to a 6 or 7. This will make a pasta that's thin, but still slightly on the thicker side. It's basically at the point where I can almost see my fingers through it when I lay the pasta on top of my hands, but not completely all the way see-through yet. But you can always go as thin or as thick as you like it. When I'm done rolling my sheets as thin as I would like it, I like to set it aside onto my island on the side, and I'll just let those sit there and hang out until I'm ready to cut my pasta sheets into noodles. And the reason I like to do this is because I think that they're easier to cut into noodles when the pasta sheets have slightly dried out a little bit. So by setting it aside, that pasta will start to dry. It won't dry completely because it'll only be there for like 15 minutes. But it's enough to take away some of the tackiness of the dough. It gets a little bit stiffer, and that makes it easier to cut. This also helps the process to go a little bit quicker as well, because I don't have to keep switching between rolling out my pasta and cutting it. I can do all the rolling all at once and then switch to the cutting later. So I'm going to continue with the rest of my little pasta dough segments, working with 2 pieces at a time and rolling them into these long sheets. Once all my sheets are rolled out, it's time to cut into noodles, and my machine has this little attachment that you can add on that has two settings for different noodles. There's a really skinny one, which is kind of like a spaghetti, and then a slightly thicker one, which is kind of like fettuccine. I'm going to be doing both of these for different applications, and then I'm also going to be hand cutting some noodles as well. First off, I'm going to go on the thicker setting, which is more of like the fettuccine noodles, and roll my pasta sheets through there, and it's going to cut it into these perfectly sized noodles. And I like to cut my pasta on the setting when I want to dry it because it's not as finicky to work with as the super skinny noodles. And after I roll that through, I'm going to hang them on my hanger, just making sure the noodles are not overlapping. And I liked the idea of hanging them because then as gravity kind of holds them down, it keeps the noodles a little bit straighter, so you don't have to worry about like very curled noodles. And it was a lot quicker to work with than when I tried to lay my noodles flat. So I'm going to do a couple of my sheets this way. I think I ended up using 3 out of my 8 sheets for these dried noodles. And once they were arranged on my hangers, I just hung that up, and this is how they look. I just have to let them dry until they are nice and hard and snap really easily, and that usually only takes about 3 days. The next type of noodle I'm going to make is on the thinner setting, which makes really skinny noodles, and I really like to make these skinnier noodles for when I am making noodles for soup. And also before I run my sheets through the cutters, I like to sprinkle lots of flour on because that helps for the noodles not to stick to each other after they've been cut. And I just love how pretty these skinny little noodles are. They look so good. And then once they have been cut, I am going to make these little nests with them, sprinkle more flour on top, and kind of like fluff it up to make sure the flour is distributed around the noodles so that they don't stick together. And I'm actually going to be cooking these today, even though we're not going to be eating them today. So I'm just going to set those aside and we're going to cook them before I cook the other pasta for dinner. And the last type of pasta that I'm cutting is going to be a very wide noodle, and since I don't have a setting on my cutter that will make these wide noodles, I'm just going to do it by hand, which is going to be really easy because since they're very wide, I won't have to make a lot of cuts. So I'm going to flour my sheets and then kind of like roll it up on itself a few times. And then take my knife and just hand cut my noodles to whatever width I want. I'm doing super wide noodles here, maybe like an inch wide. I'm kind of going for like pappardelle style noodles here. Is that how you say it? Pappardelle? I don't know. By the way, another option to save your pasta for later that I'm not going to be showing you here is you can freeze it. And usually for freezing, I like to do this with uncooked noodles. I'll just make sure they're nicely floured, kind of nest them up into little bundles, put it on a sheet tray, let them freeze all the way, and then you can put those into Ziploc bags. I've done this a couple of times and they do cook up really nicely, but I just prefer not to freeze my pasta just because I don't like taking up freezer space if there are other ways to do it, because freezer space is always in high demand and we just never have enough space in our freezers. And I just think it's a lot more convenient to have dried pasta in my pantry. So that's what I prefer to do, but if you want to freeze your pasta, you can go ahead and do that at this point. Now it's time to cook the pasta, and as with any other pasta you would cook, I'm going to salt the cooking water, and I'm actually going to be cooking the thinner noodles that are going to be for a dish later this week. I just like to cook my noodles and store them in the fridge that way rather than storing them uncooked. That way the color won't change because again they might turn a little bit of a grayish color if you leave them in the fridge for too many days. And I also have to worry a little bit less about them sticking because even though I've floured the noodles, I still find that they will stick no matter what when I store them uncooked. So I prefer to just cook them all the way and then portion it out and put it into my dishes later on. After they're cooked, I can put them in a noodle bowl, which I'm going to show you later, or you can stir fry them up. Fresh pasta cooks really quickly, so after a few minutes those noodles are ready to come out. I added more water to the pot, and then I'm going to cook my wide noodles that I'm going to be using for dinner tonight. Once they're cooked up, they are so wide and they've kind of puffed up and they look so good. I've never actually made homemade pasta this wide, so it's kind of fun to have a different shape to play around with. I'm just going to toss this really simply with this jar of homemade tomato sauce that I had hanging out in my fridge. I'm going to lightly dress that and add plenty of fresh cracked pepper, and then I also added a spoonful of my eggplant caponata sauce that I canned up this past year. This has eggplant, peppers, tomatoes, capers, and lemon juice in it, and it's a really nice addition to pasta. Then to finish it off, I'm going to grate some fresh Parmesan cheese on top and mix that in, and then the pasta for tonight is finished. So that was the first way that we enjoyed our homemade pasta. It's a pretty classic preparation, but it was simple and delicious. And honestly, homemade pasta really doesn't need too much to dress it up and make it really great. And then for the next day, I'm going to show you how I made this delicious noodle bowl. First off, in my pot, I'm starting with some anchovy and kelp broth. And this is a broth I really love to make, and it's great for noodle dishes. It has a little bit more of a mild flavor than chicken broth, but it has a nice savoriness and saltiness. And I think it kind of just tastes like seawater in like the best way possible. And once that's boiling, I'm going to add some of our homemade dumplings. These are actually the dumplings that I made in a video for Chinese New Year, and I'm going to boil those for about 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, I am going to add some of our homegrown bok choy, and right now I'm just adding the stems because they take a little bit longer to cook. And then I'm going to add my pre-cooked egg noodles. These are the thinner noodles that I cooked the other day. And then I'm going to plop that into the pot. It does look very like stuck together right now, but as it's immersed in the hot liquid, the broth is going to kind of separate the noodles. And if you're worried about sticking, you can always toss your noodles with oil after you've boiled them and store them that way. But since I knew I was going to put it in a soup, I wasn't worried about that. So that just needs a couple minutes to warm up for those noodles to separate, and then at the very last minute, I'm going to add the greens of the bok choy, and those will just take about like 30 seconds to wilt down and cook. I'm going to add a drizzle of soy sauce to the bowl, and I love to have lots of nice toppings in my noodle bowls. I feel like it just makes it look really beautiful and complete and like something you would get at a restaurant. So first I added a nice jammy egg, topped it with some thinly sliced scallions, and then I also added a sprinkle of furikake on top, and that is the finished bowl. Such a comforting, delicious bowl of soup, and those homemade noodles were perfect in there. And this makes for like a really quick lunch since I pre-cooked those noodles the other day. So I always like to go ahead and cook some noodles whenever I'm making fresh pasta for another meal so that you can have fresh pasta without having to go through the entire process again. Alright, so it's a few days later and I just wanted to give you guys a little update on the dried pasta. So I showed you how I hung the pasta up on hangers and I thought it was a brilliant idea. It went really smoothly as far as putting the pasta onto the hangers. It didn't take me a lot of time and they looked really nice when I first put them on there. Later that night, Aaron was doing the dishes and he told me he saw like one strand of pasta on the floor. And I was like, okay, maybe one of the cats had clawed at it. Junie. And I was going to move it to a different room where I could close the door and they couldn't get to it. And as soon as I tried to move the hangers of pasta, all the pasta just started like raining down. They were kind of like cracking along where they were hanging on the hanger and they just like all completely fell off the hanger as I was trying to move it. It was actually pretty hilarious. They were at this like weird stage where they were pretty dried out, but they were simultaneously like still kind of soft, but also extremely brittle. And they were just like cracking off the hangers. So I ended up taking them off the hangers and I just moved them to the sheet tray to finish drying. And at that point, they were already dry enough where I didn't have to worry about them sticking together. So I just piled them like all on top of each other. And now they're completely dry. I think it's been like 3 days. And just to give it a little test, I just make sure that they snap really easily and you hear that little sound. So yeah, now the pasta is finished drying and I'm just going to store it away for another use. And I like to store my pasta in this hard food storage container. This one's really nice because it's long, so it's really good for pasta. And I like to do this over a Ziploc bag because then they won't get crushed and I can keep them as whole as possible. And that's another reason why I like to do my pasta kind of in smaller batches for preserving, because then I can just stick to having this one container always filled with pasta, hopefully for the next couple meals or so, rather than having to put all my pasta into bags where they can potentially get really crushed. And also in my container, I like to keep one of these little silica packets, which are nice to have anytime I have anything that I'm like drying or dehydrating, just to wick out any residual moisture, especially because we do live in a humid climate, especially going into the summer. In case any moisture gets in there, I like to have one of those in food containers just to protect from any humidity or mold growing. So now I'm just going to transfer all the pasta to here, and then we're going to be finished with this batch of pasta. But with one batch of pasta dough, I was able to do 2 different kinds of fresh pasta for the week and still have some to preserve. So with one dough, I had 3 different uses out of it, which I think is pretty cool. And I don't think it was too much work for the amount of fresh pasta we get. So hopefully this video gave you some ideas. And also, if you have any tips for drying pasta, please leave them in the comments down below. I'm still trying to figure out the best way to dry my pasta, since the hanger thing didn't turn out as smoothly as I thought it would. To be honest, I think I would still do it again because it still speeds up the process so much more when I'm actually like setting up the fresh pasta. And maybe next time I'll just let it dry like that for a couple of hours before transferring it to a sheet tray preemptively before all the pasta falls off on its own. Or maybe I'll like just lay something underneath so that when they do fall, they land on something clean and not the floor. But yeah, I'm not really sure why that happened because I think people do hang up their pasta to dry. They make like pasta drying racks that are like that. So I'm not really sure where that went wrong, but if you have any tips, please let me know down below. But I'm gonna put this pasta away right now. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and that it gave you some ideas for making fresh pasta, maybe some tips and tricks. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again in the next video.